As a matter of fact, I would encourage you just to leave your Bibles open because I'll be taking you through primarily chapter 1 and chapter 3 of the book of Daniel. And I will be referring to different verses, and perhaps you can follow along and see what I'm trying to point out. Now, I need to make a disclaimer at the beginning tonight. I teach homiletics. I have done so since 1987, and I think I mentioned in one of the earlier services that it's one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in my life to watch young preachers begin to blossom and see God help them. And I had a couple of Haitian boys who came to Hope Sound and were in my homiletics class, and one of them was a young man by the name of Sonel Mesedieu. I think that's the way you say the last name. Sonel spoke Creole so rapidly that people who spoke Creole could hardly follow him. And he tried to speak English that same way, and he couldn't halfway speak English. So his preaching in class was a desperate struggle to try to keep up with him. He moved very rapidly, he was nervous and high-strung, and it was difficult trying to preach in another language. In the latter part of that class, we look at what I call modern sermonic forms, and there are several different ones of those that we look at. One of them is a form that is called black narrative. Now, you may have heard some black preachers at different times preach and use a style where they have a certain theme and they come back to that theme over and over again, and they'll wander out here and pull in a few scriptures and tell a story and come back to that theme, and then they'll go over here and come back to that theme. Probably one of the most well-known of those kind of sermons is the one that Tony Campolo gave about It's Friday, but Sunday's coming. If you ever heard that, I think Dobson aired that on his broadcast, and it was enough to bring you out of the seat. When he got to the end, he hollered, "It's Friday," and the people responded with, "Sunday's coming." Well, there is benefit in that form. It emphasizes a central theme that people can take home with them. And this young man said, that kind of preaching helped me more than anything else. And then he used the basic thoughts that I'm going to use tonight, and it was the best sermon he ever preached. And I asked his permission to use his thoughts, so I'm going to share them with you tonight. So I told Sonel, when I preach this, I'll tell them that I got it from you. God's helping him. He and his friend are being wonderfully used of God. They were saved in a Pentecostal church, came to Hope Sound, and were wonderfully sanctified. Both of those young men really were settled spiritually, and God is blessing. They're working with about 7 or 8 Haitian churches there in South Florida. It's wonderful to see what God is doing. He asked me to speak for a youth rally here a while back, and I couldn't believe it. I got there, and there were about 300 young people ready to listen to me speak. So I thank God for what he's done for Sonel. The story tonight is a very familiar one. All of us growing up learned the stories of David and Goliath, Daniel in the lion's den, the 3 Hebrew boys, and we could go on and mention several others. And tonight, I would like to focus our attention on those young men that are that their story is recorded here in the beginning of the book of Daniel. Daniel, of course, was one of them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are the others that and that's the name we know them by. But as I look at those young men, they have simply challenged my heart with some of the things that God helped them to do. And I think there are some very practical lessons that you and I can gain from their lives. The first lesson that I want to look at tonight is I want to point out the fact that these young men were uprooted from their home environment and carried far, far away. But they never forgot who they were. They were surrounded by a different culture. They ate different food, but they never forgot who they were. These young men not only remembered who they were when they were far from home, but they remembered who they were when they were pressed by the world around them to conform and to fit into the mold that others were making for them. They never forgot who they were. Third, they remembered who they were in spite of the fact that they climbed the ladder of success to the very top. There was not a chance that they could go any higher than they went, being foreigners in an alien environment. They climbed to the top. But even there, in the midst of success, they didn't forget who they were. Then, when they were pressed to compromise their principles, not just at the threat of losing their position, but at the threat of losing their lives, they didn't forget who they were. And then, when threats became reality and they were cast into the burning, fiery furnace, they did not forget who they were. Now, the application of that to you and me is, it's wonderful to come to camp meeting. It's great to be with a bunch of Christians, be in an environment where everybody's come, well, not everybody, but lots of people are coming to early morning prayer meeting. Good friends, friends that will help you and encourage you and challenge you in the things of God are all around you. If you're a young person, there are other young people here who are trying to do what's right. You go to the altar and some of them will come help you pray. Even when you're out there on the recreation field, there's the benefit of a Christian environment. That's wonderful. But you know what? In just a matter of hours, you're going to be a long, long ways from camp meeting. And I hope you remember who you are. Let me give you a little background of this story. Israel had come under the judgment of God. God had warned them again and again and again, I'm going to pour out my judgment upon you if you don't turn. God had sent prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah. He had sent prophets like Ezekiel. He had sent prophets like Elijah and Elisha. Wonderful miracles had followed in some cases, and passionate preaching, fearless preaching had been the order of the day. Jeremiah had ended up in a pit. He had ended up in prison. He'd been accused of being a traitor simply because he said what God told him to say. And in spite of all of that, these people simply would not listen. They sought out prophets who would tell them what they wanted to hear. There was never a shortage of prophets. There was never a shortage of the Word of God. The only problem was their Word of God didn't match prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah. And the tragedy was they finally got to the place where they pushed God over the line. God drew a line in the sand, as it were, and said, I am going to wipe the land of Israel like a man wipes a dish, turning it upside down. In the book of Ezekiel, in chapters 9 to 12, we have that tragic picture of the gradual withdrawal of the Spirit of God. You remember the glory of God dwelt on the mercy seat between the cherubims. And it talks of the Spirit moving from the mercy seat to the door of the tabernacle, and then to the gate of the city, and then to the hillside. And then the Spirit of the Lord was gone. Not because he wanted to leave, but because he was simply driven out by their idolatry and their self-will and their self-centeredness. And judgment finally came. God let the king of Babylon come, and he conquered the city and brought them under tribute and went back home. But these people were not about to live under tribute, so they had an insurrection. And he sent his armies back, and they conquered them again. They besieged the city. It got horrible until there were literally people in that city eating their own children. We have the graphic details in Scripture. Eventually the city was broken down, and the king of Babylon said, I have had enough of Jerusalem. That's when they battered the walls down and burnt the gates. That's when they plowed the streets. That's when they tore down every great man's house and every noble man's house. That's when they slaughtered all of those who were leaders. That's when they took those younger ones who were moldable, and they took them and transplanted them to Babylon so they could reprogram them, make them think and talk and act and live like Babylonians. And then they moved other peoples into the area. Their whole goal was to break down this resistance. So as Brother Sutherland preached this afternoon, the city was just a heap of rubble. The people that were left in the land were people who soon mingled with other peoples whom the king of Babylon had moved in, and they intermarried, and they lost their identity, and they lost their religion, and they lost their hope of the future, and they lost any will to rebel. And it looked like the land of Israel was stamped out forever. It looked like they would go the way of every other group of people who had been crushed by a superior power in the pages of history. It looked like it was over. Those who went to Babylon found themselves there in a totally different environment. The first verse of this first chapter of Daniel tells us this all happened because God gave King Jehoiakim into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. God poured out his judgment. God kept his word. I don't want to be a doomsdayer, but I must say to you that we simply cannot continue as a nation to rush in the direction we are going without putting ourselves in exactly the same place these people put themselves. That's why you, as a Christian, are vitally important. Vitally important. You remember the angel came and said to Lot, Lot, get out of this city. We can't do anything as long as you're here. You remember when Abraham was praying on the mountain, God had said to him, if there are a mere 10 righteous people in those vile, wicked cities, I will preserve them. That's incredible. That means that God respects the presence of righteous people to such a level that he would turn away his judgment from Sodom and Gomorrah because of the presence of righteous people in those cities. What that says to me is, friend, you and I have a responsibility to live holy, to live a righteous life, to be an influence for God and good and righteousness in our culture. God allowed the king of Babylon to come and conquer them. Not only did he allow them to come and conquer them, but if you look at verses 2 and 3, the Lord gave them into his hand, and the king took away the vessels, the wealth that was there. He took it away and took it to the house of his God, the treasure house of his God. And the king spoke to the man who was over his eunuchs, and he said, I want you to pick out the best and the brightest. I want you to get the children of the king's seed, those in the kingly line. I want you to get the brightest and the most capable and the most talented, the young, the ones we can influence. And I want you to bring them with you. That's how Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and others as well, ended up in Babylon. They were far from everything and anything that even began to resemble their home. There was no temple there to the God Jehovah. There were temples of all kinds that were simply focused on splendor and grandeur and all of the rest. But there was no temple to the Most High God. There was no teaching school to remind them of the law of God. There was no influence of godly parents and grandparents and even great-grandparents. All those influences were gone. These young men were far, far, far from home. Everything they loved and cherished had been ripped away. Very likely they had seen their own parents or their own relatives slaughtered before their eyes. And now here they are, far, far, far away from home. How easy it would be in that circumstance to grow bitter at God and begin to say, Lord, if you really cared, why did you let this happen? Lord, why am I here? Why didn't you let me go the way of all of them? Why did you bring me to Babylon? But these young men didn't do that. They remembered who they were. The reason we know they remembered who they were is because when society began to press them into its mold, they resisted. Look with me, if you will, at verse 4. In verse 4 it said, these were children without blemish, well-favored, skillful in all wisdom and cunning. And they brought them that they might teach them the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. It's no wonder that the king of Babylon was such a successful monarch. It's impossible for me to understand, for us to comprehend how a man without the benefit of satellite communication, without the benefit of rapid transportation, could ever rule such a sprawling empire. But here's part of his secret. He brought these capable people, and then he began to systematically make them into people who lived and acted and thought like he did. Then he could send them back. Then they could become his emissaries to go back to their own people and talk the language, think in the same philosophical lines of reasoning that his people had thought in. He would make them Babylonians, and then they would make others Babylonians. And you know, tonight, that's always been the devil's business. The attack of Satan against the church of Jesus Christ has never wavered. First of all, he would like to get rid of the church. And if he can't get rid of the church, he would like to lose the church in the world. You look at the first 300 years of the church, and it's a bloody 3 centuries. Christians were fed to the lions in the arenas. Christians were dipped in oil and set ablaze to light Nero's gardens. Christians were ripped apart. It became legal to ravage their homes. Satan was trying to do everything in his power to stamp out the church. But with the rise of Constantine to power in the Roman Empire, things changed. Constantine was supposed to have had a vision. He's supposed to have seen a cross in the sky and the words, "And this sign conquer." And it wasn't long until the Roman legions were marching out to battle under banners emblazoned with crosses. It wasn't long until it became the in thing to be a Christian. Now you had people who wanted to curry favor from the government, bowing to the religion of the emperor, not the lordship of Jesus Christ. And so what began to happen was the trappings of Christian religion began to be intermingled with the traditional worship of people. And do you know what happened as a result of that? That began a period that led us into the darkest of all ages. In fact, it's called the Dark Ages. Little by little by little, the church and the world were lost in each other. Until you could have all of the religion in the world and still be very much of the world. We see the climax of that in Martin Luther's day. It's not as though there wasn't a church. The church was literally ruling the world. Popes brought emperors to their knees, threatening to ban them and excommunicate them and keep them from the Holy Sacrament. They ruled the world. But ironically, at a time when they ruled the world, it was the darkest, most dismal, most hopeless time there ever was. Oppression was everywhere. Sin and vice was everywhere. The church had gotten to the place until Tetzel was traveling through Germany selling indulgences. You could buy your way out of purgatory. You could buy a night of fun if you dropped some coins in his coffer so he could build a basilica in Rome. And the tragedy is the hand on the helm was the hand of the, quote, church. Satan couldn't crush the church, so Satan lost the church in the world. And this man, this king, began to try to do that with these young men. He began to press them and shape them and mold them and fit them into his box. I want you to talk my language. I want you to learn my learning as it's described here. I want you to learn how we think. I want you to have a name.
As a matter of fact, that was given to them. They were fed his food in verse 5. Their names were changed in verse 6. He was trying to do a remake on these young guys. Friend, I have to tell you tonight that Satan has not changed his basic tactics. The basic tactics are still the same. Philip's translation is powerful when he comes to that verse that says, be not conformed to this world. He says, don't let this world press you into its mold. There are 1,000 ways that can happen. You know, we come here to camp meeting, we enjoy the fellowship, the godly focus, we enjoy services throughout the day, praying together. It's a wholesome atmosphere that nurtures spiritual life. Friend, when you walk out of here, you walk out into a different world. You walk out into a world that presses you on every side to fit in, to be a part, to go along. Don't make waves. Don't be a problem. It's everything from our families. When our kids come saying, Dad, everybody else is. Dad, we're the only ones. We're weird. To our larger families, where people come around and say, you know what? If you live that way, you're going to lose your kids. Oh, I remember my mother's youngest brother, Frank. I visited him just 2 weeks ago. And I remember him mocking her and saying, Jewel, let me tell you something. There's a day your kids will rise up and curse you if you insist on them living as you live. But I'll tell you what, when Mother's Day comes, we rise up and call her blessed. These young men experience the pressure. And I want to tell you, if you've made spiritual progress in this camp meeting, I can guarantee you that spiritual progress will be challenged when you go back to work and back to the community and back to the home, if your home is not a Christian home, and back to the school or back to the old circle of friends. All of a sudden, there's the clashing of trying to live in a world when you don't talk the same language and you don't think the same way. And the thing that's so tragic is that so many people get tired of that struggle, get tired of that battle, and end up just saying, well, I guess there's not much you can do. I guess this is the way it's going. Friend, I want to tell you, that's not the way you keep God's blessing on your life. That's not the way you keep the joy of the Lord in your heart. These young men did not forget who they were. It clashed for them quickly. They came and said, the king has decreed that you will eat the food from off his table. The king has also decreed that you drink the same wine he drinks. But the Bible says Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Now, it's incredible to me how Daniel handled this, and I think we can take some lessons from this. Instead of Daniel standing up and saying, we don't eat that kind of junk, Daniel talked privately with the man and pled with him for an opportunity to try an experiment. He said, let us eat pulse and drink water. Now, pulse, of course, was the simplest kind of diet you could possibly have. And he wasn't asking for anything special. In fact, the man feared that if he let them eat what they asked to eat, that they would be skinny and puny and look bad when it came time for them to stand before the king. He said, I can't do that. It'll endanger my head. Fortunately, they had a little time, so Daniel said, let's try. Let's do an experiment. And if we're worse off at the end of that time, so be it. But God honored their remembering who they were. God honored it. And when the time came, the Bible says they were more flourishing than any of the rest. Pardon me. It wasn't because of the diet. It was because of the disposition of their heart that was set to say, I'm going to serve God no matter what happens. Oh, friend, if I can just challenge you tonight, if you've made commitments to God around this altar, if you've settled some issues in your soul, I will promise you the devil is going to try to pry those things loose. He's going to try to knock you off track. He'll hit you in every way he possibly can, and with some of the people that are the most special to you. But I want to tell you tonight, ultimately, the only way to be what you ought to be is to purpose in your heart that you're going to remember who you are and who you serve. These young men remembered that. Because they remembered God, God especially helped them. I happen to believe that Christianity has a basically elevating influence on lives and families. I look back at my mother's family. They were very, very, very poor people. Didn't have anything, basically. And the circumstances of their life were only made worse by the fact that many of the vices of this world got their slimy hands on the few dollars they did have. And the basic influence was a degrading one. You know, when Jesus Christ came into that family and began to save some of those kids, the result was an elevation of the very lifestyle that they lived. I had a friend who worked at General Motors, and he walked into work one Monday morning, and a man walked up to him and said, "Hey, man, how was your weekend?" He said, "Oh, I was okay." He said, "What'd you do?" "Well," I said, "I mowed the grass, and I worked around the house, and my wife and I went out to eat." He said, "Ah, man, you don't know what fun is." And the guy said, "Well, what did you do?" "Oh," he said, "I went to this party, and man, did we have a time. I got smashed, and he was telling all of the things and the women he'd met and all of that kind of stuff." My friend had heard that he'd also wrecked his car on the way home. And when they did a breath analysis, they found him to be legally drunk, and that meant his license was going to be pulled. And so he just casually looked at him and said, "Sounds like you had a big time. Sounds like you had a real big time. As a matter of fact, is that why your car's smashed up?" He said, "You know, you're the strangest guy. You go out and get yourself silly drunk. You go to living with women that you don't know who they are or what kind of disease you may have. You smash your car up on the way home. You lose your license, and then you tell me you're having fun." And the guy looked at him and said, "Man, you take all the joy out of life." I need to tell you tonight, there's a reason. There's a reason why some people's lives are in shambles. And I want to tell you that grace has a naturally elevating influence in the lives of people. Last November, I had the privilege of going to England and visiting Wesley sites. And there I stood on Hannam Mount where John Wesley preached to the coal miners. You read about those coal miners in English history. I'm reading a history of Methodism right now, and they describe those people as savages. They said they literally live like savages. That's where John Wesley began to preach. Ironically, John Wesley had come to Bristol to preach on Hannam Mount from Oxford, the center of learning and intelligence in England. You go to the halls of Christ College where Wesley and his brother Charles were educated. And there in the Great Hall, you see Henry VIII's large life-size picture at one end. You see a host of other English notables around. Those young men went to that same college. But the day came when God led them out of the splendor of the English church and into the fields to preach to these savage people. As Wesley preached to those people, and he had an uncanny way of naming sin and angering people, and there were times when the historical record tells us the brickbats flew, the rotten tomatoes and eggs flew. Wesley would find himself pelted with those kind of things until he went home with his clothes stinking. I want to tell you something. The sledgehammer of gospel power broke down the barriers. Wesley would go out at 5 o'clock in the morning and preach to those coal miners before they descended into the mines. Their lives were perilous lives. They never knew when there would be gases escaping into the mine and kill them. But after all, they were just savages. Just get the coal out. If it takes a few guys, what have we lost? Wesley preached to them about the grace of God and the transforming power of the gospel. And some of those guys began to get saved. He'd be there in the evening when they came out of the mines, and sometimes they would get on their knees, their faces blackened with coal dust, and the tears they would cry would cut little trenches down through the coal dust on their face, and God would come into their hearts and lives, and they began to change the course of their life. Their drinking, their immorality, their gambling, all of the other things that took everything that was of substance in their life and blew it away, that was gone, and God began to make out of them men who had families and cared for them and provided for them. Today, as you stand on Hannah Mount, you don't see the hovels of savages. You see a nation whose history was literally changed by the preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Friend, I want to tell you tonight, the gospel of Jesus Christ is still just as powerful as it ever was. And there's an elevating influence in the gospel. These young men, while they didn't have New Testament gospel, these young men served God and did what they should be doing. They honored Him and He honored them. And when they got to the end of their terms, the description of these young men is remarkable. They graduated at the top of their class in verse 19. In verse 20, they not only were at the top of their class, but they knew 10 times more than all of the others in their class. In fact, also in verse 20, they were better than all of the magicians and astrologers in the entire realm of the king. Our sewage treatment plant there on the campus of Hope Sound Ministries was the closest to the intercoastal waterway of any such plant on the eastern seaboard of the United States. And we were informed by the EPA that we would shut that plant down. Well, that was significant because that meant hooking up to the municipal sewer system, which in itself could cost about $250,000. It meant the redoing of our infrastructure and a whole bunch of other things. Altogether, it was going to cost the better part of $1 million to accomplish that. We went and talked to the people that run Martin County Utilities, and they were very resistant. The man who was head of it said, "I want you to know, I will fight to the end to keep them from giving you any break whatsoever." Well, it happens that the Martin County Utilities is owned by the city of, or the town of Jupiter Island. And Jupiter Island is an exclusive little island with about 647 residents in it. Some of the richest people in the world live there. So we went to the town council and talked to them. When we got to the town council, this is something of what was said. The mayor of Jupiter Island, himself a very, very wealthy man, a blue blood wealthy man, said, "Well, you know, we have a great appreciation for that quaint little community across the intercoastal waterway." Well, I don't necessarily delight in being called a quaint little community, but I certainly was happy to say that to hear him say that they had an appreciation for that quaint little community. So they scheduled a meeting. The entire council met. The men who operated the Martin County Utility met with them. And this man became very, very strong in the meeting, pounding on the table and saying, "If you're going to give these people a break, you're going to get my resignation." It was silent for a minute in the room. And then the mayor stood up and said, "We'll accept that resignation." And then he said, "We have a deep appreciation for that institution and the people there. They work in our homes and don't steal. They don't get drunk and lay out on Monday and Tuesday and leave early on Friday. Across the years, we've developed a close and warm relationship with them. And we want that community to stay there, sir, so we'll accept your resignation." Not only did they do that, But they then turned around and made it possible for us to make that necessary change without it being a burden that would just crush us into oblivion. What I'm saying is, it pays to live for God and to live by His principles and His guidelines. These young men didn't forget who they were, and God gave them His special help. I have to tell you today that I seldom crawl on an airplane, and I do that frequently coming from Florida. I seldom crawl on an airplane, but what it crosses my mind, I sure hope those mechanics didn't cheat their way through mechanic school. I sure hope those air traffic controllers didn't cheat on that final examination of theirs, because we live in a society where the moral values have slipped so dramatically that you don't know who has got what legally. If there ever was a time when Christians need to be their best, if there ever was a time when we need to give all diligence to live as God would have us to live, these are the days to do that. These are not days to go with shoddiness and carelessness and indifference. These are days to remember who you are and live like it, even when you're in an environment and in a world that is not friendly to the way you're living. When these young men received honor and elevation, they didn't forget who they were. How easy it is to honor God until the blessing and the recognition comes, and then decide that the way to keep that is to begin to compromise those very principles that got you there. These young men did not do that. I was astonished recently when I was reading the history of the Church of the Nazarene, book entitled Call Unto Holiness. If you want something that will challenge you, if you like history at all, and you want something that will challenge you, you ought to read that book. I was astonished to discover that Phineas Bresee, the founder of the Church of the Nazarene, at one time served on the board of the University of Southern California. He and a medical doctor in the Methodist Church formed a medical school at the University of Southern California. You know, so many, many times, those kind of things have brought us the kind of pressure. You know, we wouldn't agree with John Ashcroft in every way theologically. There would be some very sharp differences there. But I'll tell you what, you've seen something of the vicious attacks that have been unleashed against a man who lives by principle. We've seen it on display. I simply want to say to you that when you find yourself being promoted and moving in the right direction, don't forget who you are. These young men didn't. When they were promoted, that put them in an elite group. And the king of Babylon wanted to make sure that that elite group was particularly loyal to him. They ruled over provinces. They ruled over various segments of those provinces. And so the king would occasionally throw a tremendous banquet for all of those people, call them all together, wine them and dine them, and let them know how important they were to his kingdom. And then sometimes he would call them to a public commitment that often took the form of worship. And that's exactly what happened here. When we get to chapter 3 of the book of Daniel, you find the king setting up a huge gold image in the plains of Dura. And then he called all of the leaders together. And these Hebrew children were a part of that group. And when they got there, they were informed that when they heard the sound of the music, they were to bow to the image. When everything was said and done, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't nearly so interested in whether you actively practiced his religion. He simply wanted the public commitment of your life that you were on board. You were going his way. So he offered the simple command, bow when the music plays. And then he offered the dire warning, if you don't bow, you'll burn in the fiery furnace. Well, it doesn't take a lot of reasoning to figure out that you'd rather bow than burn on the normal level. Here were men who nearly lost their lives in the siege of Jerusalem. Here were men who had come here and faced crisis right up front over whether they were going to eat the king's food and drink the king's wine. Here were men who'd been honored by God, and now they're in these high positions. And it's not just a question, are we going to keep our job? It's a question, are we going to keep our life? We're not told all that went through their minds. But I can imagine that as they're standing there listening to the instructions, as they're standing there looking the crowd over, there are other Jews in that crowd that they know came through the same class they did. And I can see them saying, I think he's going to bow. I'm pretty sure he'll bow. I believe he will. I'm afraid he will. And all of a sudden, it comes crystal clear to them. If you don't bow, everybody's going to know it. Everybody else is going to be on their face, and you're going to be the only ones standing up. Now, I can't prove this by Scripture, but based on the experience I've had of the devil working and challenging and tempting in my own life and in the lives of others, I can imagine that Satan came to them and said, listen, this is not about worship. This is about loyalty, and you're loyal to King Nebuchadnezzar. You're not going to start any insurrection, man. Just go ahead and bow. Just go through the motions. 99% of the people here don't believe in the gods that he worships. All he wants out of you is a commitment of loyalty. Go ahead and bow. Then you can go on and serve God in your high position. That makes good sense, doesn't it? Wonderful sense. Excellent idea. You bend in the wind so you can rise later to serve. That's exactly what Erasmus did in the days of the Reformation. But Erasmus didn't bring a Reformation. Luther did. And friend, I need to tell you tonight that the subtle pressure of the enemy will come at you from every side. And you'll find all the logical reasoning you could ever possibly need to round the corners and shave the edges and fit in with the world that's pressing on you from every side. And you can reason, well, I can be a lot more blessing to the kingdom of God in this position than if I lose this job, if I'm out of a job. There were lots of reasons why these young men could have bent when the pressure to compromise turned into a threat of persecution. But I have to challenge you to remember who you are when that happens. I had a young man in my church, very capable young man, had a degree in architecture and went into several different other things and eventually began to work for the state of Ohio. At a crucial point in his life, someone else picked up on him. He did some side work for a fellow, and the man offered him a job at far higher pay. Offered him an administrative position. At the state of Ohio, everything was done by seniority. He could never get through the ranks until these old guys retired or whatever. And so he took the opportunity. And it was exciting for him. His pay went up dramatically. His responsibility went up dramatically. He handled himself very, very well. On one project, he missed the grade on a road and went back on his own time, fixed it. The owner of the company came by and said, Blevins, I like your work, buddy. I like your work. You're headed to the top in this company. We rejoiced with him. He had an afflicted girl who was going to make extraordinary demands on his resources. Some of you who were at convention a few years ago saw that little girl in a wheelchair, and their family was there in the building for keep service a couple of years ago. But the day came when the boss came and said, now, you know, in this position, there's some social functions that you're going to have to attend, and there's some that you're going to have to lead. And he told me, he said, I really didn't think much about that until I went to the first one. And he said, I found myself in an environment I was totally uncomfortable with. Totally uncomfortable with. He said, I was the only one there that wasn't drinking. There were lots of other things that were going on that I was just totally uncomfortable with. And before I could think of a way to say to my boss, I don't feel comfortable in those surroundings, he informed me it was our turn to put a similar thing on, and I was responsible. And he came to talk to me. We sat in my study, and he said, my salary's doubled. And the doors of opportunity are all open to me. It's just a matter of time. But he said, I've run head on into this. And he said, I talked to my boss about it. He said, he wasn't mean, he was just kind of irritated. He said, well, that goes with that job. If you're going to do that job, you're going to have to be a part of this. This is part of it. From now on up in the system, this is part of it. And now he's sitting in my office. And he's saying, Brother Stetler, I can't do it. He said, it's not just the church. He said, it's not just because I would feel bad about what you would think of me doing these things. He said, I wasn't raised in a Christian home. You know my mom and dad. My dad wouldn't have thought anything about this. He'd have led the charge. But he said, my life's never been the same since I met Beverly, and she brought me to this church, and I gave my heart to Jesus. I just cannot do it. We prayed together. He said, I got to talk to him tomorrow. I said, what time do you have to talk? He told me. I said, I'll be praying. I'll be on my knees here in this office praying for you. And you walk into his office. Then he said something that moved me deeply. He said, well, I really appreciate your prayers. And he said, I don't mean this disrespectful, but he said, my mind's made up. I'm going to do it, whether you pray for me or not. Now, I really appreciate your prayers. But he said, it's a settled issue in my heart. He walked into that office, and the boss said, I can't believe you let something like this stand in the way of the success that's there for you, Blevins. He said, you don't understand. You don't understand. He said, the home I came from, there was drinking, there was fighting, there was bitterness. And Jesus Christ so changed my life that I don't ever want to go back that way. And if I did what you're asking me to do, he wouldn't feel good about it, and I don't either. He said, as a matter of fact, I'm just going to make your job easy for you. He said, I brought my resignation. He said, well, don't you want to think about it? He said, not unless you plan to change the requirements. I said, well, I can't, man. He said, I thought that's right. I thought that's the way it would be. So here's my resignation. 2 weeks notice, but if you're finished with me today, that's all right. You know what? In less than a week, that young man got a call from the state of Ohio. They said, Blevins, we've picked up from some of our contractors that you're working for that big company over there, and we've got a position that allows you to bypass all of those guys. Would you be interested in that position? He said, you know, I just might be. Oh, they said, by the way, we've got the best health care in the business. And your daughter's going to need that. But we can get her in because our policy's so big. Blevin, you think you're interested? He never missed a day of work. He never missed a day of work. But I'll tell you why. He never forgot who he was. And because he didn't forget who he was, there's a God in heaven who didn't forget who he was. Now, lest I lead you to think the wrong thing, let me tell you another little incident. A young man walked into our church and sat on the second seat. When I was standing at the door, as he walked out, he came in a little bit late, sat there and very studiously listened as I preached. When he was walking out, I was reaching to find something that might give me some common ground, and I noticed he had an airplane tie tack on. And I said, you wouldn't happen to be a pilot, would you? And he said, yeah, how did you know that? I said, well, I noticed your tie tack. And all of a sudden, the guy got real serious. He said, as a matter of fact, that's the reason I'm here. He said, I fly for a company here in our town. And he said, I fly with a young man who used to come to this church. The young man was not a Christian. He said, I've been going through a lot of problems in my life. And I was flying along with that guy as my co-pilot, telling him about it. And he said, you ought to go to that church. So he said, that's why I'm here. He said, would you come over to my house? I'd like to talk to you. To make a long story short, that young man was gloriously saved. Gloriously saved. 38 years old, unmarried, living the life of a wild bachelor, basically, flying all over the country, girlfriends every place he went. But God wonderfully delivered him from sin. And then God began to work in his life. And I'll never forget, he came to me and he was all distressed. He said, you know, the Federal Aviation Administration requires me to fill out a form every time I take off that says on there that I have gotten so many hours sleep, that I am confident this plane is not overloaded. I have checked to see that that's true. I have to sign my name on that. He said, you know, this company that I work for is not like United Parcel or Airborne Express or one of those big companies. He said, we kind of operate on the fringes. We do the things that those big boys can't do because the inspectors are always snooping. He said, probably 80 to 90% of my jobs are overweight. I very often get called out because our motto is, we'll go anytime, we'll get it there when you need it. If it takes a Learjet, we'll get it there. So he said, over and over again, I signed my name that I'm not overweight and I have had the required sleep. He said, that's basically lying, isn't it? I said, you seem to be troubled about it. Is that what you feel? He said, yes, I think that's what the Lord thinks. I said, what are you going to do, Chris? He said, I don't have any choice. So he went in to talk to his boss. The boss got angry. But there wasn't a whole lot he could do because, see, this involved the FAA. These young men went on and they were juggling him around, making sure he had his time, making sure his flights weren't overloaded, and they worked with him because they had to. But one day he came to church and he smacked the beeper on his belt. When I asked him how he was, he smacked the beeper on his belt and said, that thing's driving me crazy. I said, oh, is it going off? No, he said, it's not going off. But when he said, when I put this on and come to church, he said, I feel like I'm saying to God, I'm going to come worship you unless this thing goes off. And then I'll go out to make money. He said, you know what's been coming to my mind? What's been coming to my mind is, thou shalt not have any other gods before me. I didn't say that to him. He said it to me. I said, Chris, what's going to happen when you walk in and tell them that you won't fly on Sunday? He said, I'm probably going to lose my job. I knew he'd just bought a house. I knew he was engaged to be married. I knew he had bought a car. I knew there were a number of other things. He said, I've already thought about this and prayed about this. And he said, I'm going in to see the head man. And he said, when I'm done talking to him, I probably won't have a job because I don't see how they can do it. The other guys are going to be mad. And sure enough, it turned out exactly like he had thought it would. The boss finally leaned across the table and with a red face and protruding veins in his neck said, you need to decide whether you want to do this Christian stuff or whether you want to fly airplanes. If you want to do this Christian stuff, you better forget about flying airplanes. That's all I've got to say to you. He said, as a matter of fact, you're going to have to decide what you want to do. Do you want to fly for this company, or do you want to keep up with your church stuff? I'll never forget what Chris told me. He said, I slid my chair back and stood up, and I said, I love to fly. I've flown all of my life. There's not anything in this world that I love more than flying. But he said, I want to tell you something, sir. What God has done for me is more important to me than flying. So you have my resignation. I was so proud of him. And I thought God would give him some super duper corporate job right out of the chute, you know. He stood up for God, so God's going to stand by him. And then a week went by, 2 weeks, and 3 weeks, and a month. And I'm calling him and saying, Chris, have you got a job yet? Well, he said, I'm doing a little flying. He said, I've gotten on out here at the county airport towing gliders. I knew enough about towing gliders to know that that was the little boy stuff that you did when you were just starting and you were wanting to rack up some hours. Just kind of mindless stuff. You know, you get a supercharged little old airplane and pull those gliders up and up and up and up and up and up, cut them loose and come back down and land, and they glide around for a while, and then you pull them again. Just sort of mindless stuff that racks up hours. And I knew a man who could fly a Learjet, a man who could fly any other kind of aircraft from a Learjet on down, towing gliders. And I was saying, Lord, what are you doing? What are you doing? This guy stood up for you. Eventually he got a job as a corporate pilot, flew for a while, and then that fizzled, and got another one and flew for a while. And I remember he flew down to see me, and he flying a nice King Air, and I walked out on the tarmac to meet him, and he stepped out of that plane and walked over toward me, and I'll never forget it. I said, Chris, that's a beautiful plane. That's the nicest looking one in this row. And he stopped right there and looked me in the eye, and he said, I want you to know I'd walk away from it in a minute if it meant flying that airplane or serving God. He said, I want you to know my heart's right where it's always been. I grabbed him and hugged him right there and on the tarmac of that airport. You know what happened? I came to Ohio a couple of summers ago. I met his wife. I said, who's Chris flying for? She said, you're not going to believe this. She said, you remember that company you flew for? Well, the boss got in trouble with the IRS. He's in prison. They've sold the company. And the guy that bought it knew they were under careful FAA scrutiny. So the guy that bought it said to the other pilots, we need a squeaky clean pilot who doesn't break any of the rules. And they said, we know the guy. He's flying for the same company. There were 7 years in there. I don't understand everything about that, but I know one thing. I know that that young man crystallized the focus of his heart and the commitment of his soul, and he served God. He served God like a trooper. And I challenge you tonight, if you'll honor God, he'll always honor you. If you'll be faithful to him, he'll always be faithful to you. These young men were pressed to bow. But when the time came, they didn't. And somebody quickly went and ratted on them. You know those Jews that you put over the realms of your kingdom. Well, they didn't bow to your image. And the Bible says Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury. You never like to have one of those kings mad at you, because they can cut your head off and nobody will even ask them why they did that. And so he called for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And if you look at verses 16 to 18, you'll see that when they came before the king, an amazing thing happened. He didn't just say, I'm throwing you in the fiery furnace. He said, I'm going to give you another chance. You know, at that point, you could have reasoned, another chance? This has got to be of God. But if you look at what these fellows said, they said, O king, verse 16, we are not careful to answer you in this matter. That word careful there means we're not eager or excited to answer you. In other words, this is not something that's got us begging your sympathy. They said, our God is able to deliver us from this fiery furnace. And our God will deliver us out of your hand, whether it's through or around this fiery furnace. And even if our God doesn't deliver us from this fiery furnace, we will not worship your God or bow to your image. When that happened, the Bible makes an interesting statement. It says, the form of his visage was changed. That's kind of an awkward way that leaves us a little confused. And so Maybe it'll help you to understand it better if I said his face was contorted with rage. He said, you heat the furnace 7 times hotter. You get the strongest men. You bind these guys with all their clothes on, and you throw them in that fiery furnace, and I'm going to watch them sparkle. No, he didn't say that last part. But he did go to watch. So they came and bound them. The fire was so furious that the flames came out and killed the men who threw them in. But when that king got to looking into that fiery furnace, all of a sudden he turned to his counselors and said, didn't we throw 3? We threw 3 men in bound. I see 4 men loose and walking. And then the most incredible statement is made. He said, the 4th is like unto the Son of God. How would a heathen king know what the Son of God looked like? How did he recognize him? The same way those 3 Hebrew boys recognized him. Because the Bible says there's coming a day when every eye shall see, and every knee shall bow, and every tongue shall confess that he is Lord to the glory of God. And this heathen king knew who he was looking at. The moment he saw him, said, the 4th is like unto the Son of God. The incredible thing about this story is, when you get to the place of them flying into the fire, you can almost hear someone say, boy, isn't that a shame? Those were good guys. A little misguided. Man, they got off the track. They were kind of radical. They're misguided. What a tragic loss. But what they didn't realize is that when you remember who you are, God remembers who you are. And when these fellas got into the fire, they found God was already there. When they got into the fire, they found out the fire had no power over them. The only thing that it burned was the ropes that bound them. When they walked out of the fire, their clothes were not burned, their hair was not singed, there was not even the smell of smoke passed on them. And the king is saying to them, there is no God in this universe like your God. And anybody who speaks a word against your God, I'm going to make his house a trash heap, because there's no God that can deliver like your God. I wish I could tell you tonight that when you walk out these doors, when you pull off of these grounds, that you'll have instantaneous and glorious deliverance just like these fellas did. I can't tell you that. There may be a 7-year gap in your life, but I can tell you this much. If you hope to have the victory when you come to Pilgrim Camp next year, you're going to have to walk out of here and remember who you are. Remember the promises you made God. Remember what you purposed to do. Remember the help God gave you. If you walk out and just get lost in the crowd, if you walk out and when the world begins to twist its vice on you, you cave in, you'll come back and struggle next year. And the tragedy is, eventually you won't come back. And you won't struggle. Somewhere down the road, there'll be the nostalgic remembrance of how it used to be when the Pilgrim Camp was in Marion.